Deku? I think he's some pro. By clouds. My head in the clouds not coming down. Chapter 66. One for all. Izuku and Nezu both froze. An attack this soon after the Horseu incident? And right after they'd switched to dorms as well? Even outside of the risk to students' safety, which was obviously the most important consideration, the PR nightmare this could cause was terrifying. Nezu didn't waste any time pulling up the security feed for the third year's practice gym, and Izuku quickly stood and came up around the desk so he could peer at the screen over the principal's shoulder. The scene on the screen was absolute chaos. The students were panicking, and Izuku was eerily reminded of the sludge villain incident. Just like then, the heroes present weren't a good match for whatever was going on, and couldn't do much except keep an eye on the writhing mess of black tendrils that was exploding from Mirio in every direction. Wait. From? It took a second for Izuku's brain to catch up and figure out what was going on, but once it did, he was torn between giggling in relief and hitting his head against the wall. So, he settled for a third option. A tired sigh that could put one of Eraser's to shame. Why couldn't All Might or Mirio have at least warned the other teachers that he might develop other powers? Eraser, we're not being attacked, Izuku said calmly. Mirio should know what's going on. Just erase his quirk and ask him if you're so concerned.
Togata does not know what's going on, Eraser growled. Who do you think is screaming and trying to fight back?
What? Izuku froze, this time in confusion, not fear. Had All Might not told him that the weird transferable quirk was a stockpiler? According to the research he'd done when he'd first tried helping Mirio with his quirk mutation, the quirk got stronger each time it was passed from mentor to student, which meant that it was collecting each holder's strengths, which logically included their quirks. This, of course, brought up the question of why All Might never used those quirks, despite the obvious advantage those powers would give him in a fight. But Izuku had given up trying to make sense of anything that man did. Case in point, why hadn't he warned his protege that he might develop other quirks? Izuku rubbed the bridge of his nose in frustration and grumbled under his breath. Just when I think that idiot can't do anything worse, he goes and outdoes himself. Okay, Eraser, new plan. Erase Mirio's quirk and send him straight to me.
I know you're not stupid, Deku.
Eraser was using his I can't believe I have to explain something so simple voice.
But I'm not about to erase a student's quirk when it's the only thing he can use to fight back against the mysterious villain attacking him.
That is his quirk, Izuku groaned. It should not be his job to explain this. It's a part of the mutation that... Just... Do you trust me?
Usually.
Eraser responded dryly. Then do what I say, Izuku ordered firmly. Erase his quirk and send him straight to me.
If you're wrong,
then I'm already grounded, so it's not a big deal, Izuku interrupted.
Problem child?
Izuku ignored the warning tone in Eraser's voice as he grabbed Nezu's phone and hung up. Aizawa would probably swear, but at least he would acknowledge that it's useless to continue the argument. Looking back at the camera footage, Izuku sighed in relief as the black tendrils disappeared and Mirio fell to the floor, visibly shaken up, but otherwise okay. Eraser had deactivated his quirk, and Izuku held his breath, waiting for Mirio's new quirk to start acting up again. But thankfully, whatever had triggered it had apparently passed, and it didn't manifest again as Mirio's friends ran up to him and started hugging him. Izuku sighed and dragged a hand down his face, before finally glancing over at Nezu. "You know exactly what's going on, don't you?" "Oh, Midoriya, what kind of hyper-intelligent principal would I be if I didn't?" Nezu smiled. "Although I am pleasantly surprised that you figured it out as well. That's assuming, of course, that you weren't told." "As if All Might would ever respect me enough to tell me anything," Izuku muttered bitterly. "I only figured it out because Mirio asked for help controlling his quirk before the school year started. Obviously, things didn't add up, but after I realized the mutations," he emphasized the excuse with finger quotes, "only occurred in a specific line of mentors and students, the rest wasn't hard to figure out." Nezu grinned mischievously. "You'd be surprised, Midoriya. It's kept many of lesser intelligence fooled for generations. Most people never think to look, and would of course dismiss such a quirk as impossible if they ever caught a whiff of it. It takes an open mind to figure out such a secret." Izuku blushed slightly. Even now, it was hard to take compliments like that into stride, even though he should be used to people actually respecting his abilities. So, he just avoided the subject entirely. "Speaking of lesser intelligence," Izuku groaned, and he knew he was probably acting way too much like a razor right now, but he was tired. "Can you get All Might over here? He should really be the one to explain this to Mirio, you know? Considering it's his fault and everything." To his surprise, that was what got a slight frown. "Well, this is an interesting predicament." Izuku glared at him suspiciously. "What?" "Well, All Might requested a few days off, and is currently off the grid with an old mentor of his." Nezu shot him a small smile, almost like he thought the whole thing was funny. "So, I suppose it's up to us to explain it then. Won't this be fun?" Izuku was about to open his mouth and argue that, no, this wasn't going to be fun, and that it wasn't his job to explain everything to do with a top-secret quirk that he wasn't even supposed to know about in the first place, but he was interrupted by the door to Nezu's office slamming open. Aizawa strode in, quickly followed by Mirio, who was looking more timid and scared than Izuku had ever seen him, which was what finally pulled Izuku out of his frustration. Yes, All Might was an idiot. And no, it wasn't Izuku's job to explain Mirio's new quirk to him, but he'd be damned if he was going to let someone else suffer because they didn't understand their quirk. Not when he could help them. Aizawa activated his quirk and glared at both Nezu and Izuku, neither of which gave an inch to his intimidation.
"Explain. Now."
Izuku glanced hesitantly between Nezu and Mirio, who was looking at Aizawa with barely concealed panic, and sighed. Aizawa obviously didn't know that All Might's quirk was transferable. From what Izuku had gathered, the number one hero hadn't told hardly anyone, even his successors' teachers who really should have known, but it wasn't his secret to tell. "Eraser," Izuku started slowly, but Aizawa cut him off.
"No."
He looked between all three of them and reactivated his quirk.
"I don't know what's going on here, and what the three of you are trying to hide, but it stops here. Got it?"
Izuku swallowed and looked at Mirio, who smiled awkwardly and shrugged. I don't really know what's going on either, so..." Izuku sighed again and looked at Nezu, who was just grinning and waiting to see what he did, which was no help at all. He rubbed the bridge of his nose in frustration. It wasn't his secret to tell, but it would make sense for Aizawa to know, and All Might obviously wasn't ever going to tell him, so... He turned to Mirio. "We are going to be discussing the specifics of your quirk," he said heavily, hoping that Mirio would be able to understand his double meaning just from his eyes. Considering that he paled slightly, Izuku had succeeded. "Are you okay with Aizawa?"
"I'm staying,"
Aizawa said firmly. "With all due respect, Erasa, that's not..." Izuku countered.
"I'm the kid's teacher, Deku."
Aizawa glared at him intensely.
"So I have a right and responsibility to know what's going on. Does anyone care to explain?"
Izuku was preparing for a staring contest, even though he knew he would probably lose in the end, considering this was Eraserhead, but thankfully Nezu cut them off before their battle of wills could even really begin. "Young Togata is beginning to develop other quirks," Nezu chirped cheerfully.
"What?"
Mirio yelled in shock, at the same time that Aizawa gave them both a deadpan glare.
"Quirks mutating I understand," Aizawa said. "But dual quirks are rare."
"And hardly ever occur naturally. Yes, I know." Izuku held up a hand to keep Aizawa quiet as he turned to Mirio again. He looked at Nezu for confirmation, and when the principal nodded, just accepted it. If All Might wanted it to remain a secret, then he should have been here. It might not be Izuku's secret to share, but on the other hand, it also wasn't Izuku's responsibility to hide it. "What has All Might told you about the past holders of your quirk?" Mirio froze, and Izuku recognized the panic welling up again, as he glanced at Aizawa and gave a last-ditch effort to laugh off the question. "Past holders? I don't know what you're Izuku cut him off with a look. "Nezu already knows. I figured it out months ago, and Aizawa apparently isn't going to leave. We're all here to help you, but we can't do that if you don't let us." Mirio stayed silent for a moment before laughing awkwardly and rubbing the back of his neck. "Well, I thought we were doing a pretty good job hiding it, but, apparently not. So, I mean, All Might told me that I think I'm the 9th? But I don't think he's told me anything about any of the others. He, doesn't like to talk about the mentor he got All for One from, so..." He smiled sheepishly and shrugged. "One for all?" Izuku asked. "Oh." Mirio's eyes widened. "I thought you said you figured it out." "I literally just traced the quirk from student to teacher for 9 generations and figured out it was transferable." Izuku deadpanned. "No one ever wrote down what it was called." "I guess that makes sense," Mirio laughed. "But yeah, he really didn't tell me."
"Are you saying that All Might gave you his quirk?"
Aizawa looked halfway between blue screen and unholy rage, which Izuku found unreasonably amusing, considering that had been his exact reaction to finding out as well.
"Setting aside the fact that that's even possible, what does that oaf think he's..."
"There will be time for fighting the number 1 hero later, Aizawa," Nezu said, with amusement. "But I believe the purpose of this conversation was to help Togata understand his little incident earlier, not to destroy a national symbol." Aizawa exhaled deeply through his nose and rubbed his eyes.
"Fine. Deku, continue."
Izuku nudged Nezu gently so he could access the keyboard. "Well, from what I understand, All Might's quirk is a stockpiler. It takes a little bit of each holder and passes it on to the next, right? Yeah, that's pretty much what he told me. Mirio shrugged. Good. Izuku swiveled the computer screen so that Aizawa and Mirio could both see it. Mirio, meet one of your predecessors, the pro-hero Lariat, also known as Daigoro Banjo, and the 5th holder of One for All. Chapter 67. Safety. Toshinori awkwardly coughed into his handkerchief as Gran poured them both coffee. Maybe he should have put his will in order before coming. Honestly, it probably wasn't a bad idea to have a will ready anyway, with the way his health was going. He really wished that visits with his old mentor could be a little less terrifying, but even being in the man's presence brought back all the feelings of inadequacy he'd felt when he was still trying to prove to Nana and Gran that he really did deserve One for All.
Oh, stop shaking, Toshinori, Gran snapped. I'm not gonna beat up some guy that's already got 2 feet in the grave, so stop freaking out so we can talk already.
Toshinori chuckled wryly.
Not even 1 foot in the grave, Gran? 2? With the way you live, you should be grateful any of you is still out of the grave at all.
Gran complained good-naturedly.
You're reckless, kiddo. So I've been told.
Toshinori fiddled with the handkerchief in his hands.
But that's not what I'm here to talk to you about. No, it's not.
Gran set down his coffee mug and heaved a heavy sigh.
You're here to talk about Deku.
Toshinori nodded sheepishly. I guess I thought I knew how the world worked, but Deku keeps proving you wrong, Gran finished. Toshinori shrugged. It wasn't necessarily that young Midoriya kept proving him wrong. It was that literally everyone else seemed willing to give him a chance from the very beginning. And Toshinori just couldn't. He didn't know how to describe it, but...
Isn't my duty as a hero to keep people safe?
Gran took a long sip of his coffee and stared out the window thoughtfully.
I suppose that comes down to the price of safety, doesn't it?
What do you mean, the price of safety? Toshinori gestured to his missing stomach.
Because if this is what you mean, I think I've already paid for it.
Gran chuckled.
I guess in some way you have, haven't you? But that's not what I mean, kid. You studied abroad in America, haven't you? What did they teach you about the Patriot Act?
Toshinori thought for a moment. His study abroad had been a long time ago, and he would be the first to admit that he paid more attention to the local villains than he had the classes. With the exception of geography, of course. He had had to learn the names of all 50 states after all. But the Patriot Act sounded familiar.
Wasn't that a pre-quirk law? He said finally. Something about international security. I didn't think it was still on the books anymore.
Gran sighed.
Even if the law was overturned, the effects still being felt hundreds of years later. And yes, it was about security. Specifically, keeping America safe from potential terrorists. The details aren't important, but the point is that the Patriot Act ordered safety, but at the cost of the privacy of the people it was supposed to be keeping safe. Can you see why the public outcry once the country realized exactly what was happening?
Not really, Toshinori said slowly.
wasn't the extra safety worth it? America was just trying to become the world's own symbol of peace, right? And that's why we're having an issue, Gran said tiredly. Kid, sometimes staying safe comes at the cost of living in a bubble. Sometimes it comes at the cost of having your own choices stomped on by everyone you meet. And sometimes, well, sometimes safety can come at the cost of happiness. Does that make any sense to you at all? Something about what Gran was saying tickled at the back of Toshinori's mind. But he still felt like there was some grand punchline that Gran was trying to get at, and he was somehow still missing it. The feeling was frustratingly similar from his time as a student. But at least now his failures weren't being punctuated by kicks to the gut. He supposed that was the perk of only having half a stomach. Gran. Toshinori stared his mentor straight in the eyes. I have given so much to keep the people of Japan safe. To keep people like Deku safe. To be the protector that I needed as a young boy. I've used One for All to become a symbol of peace, even though that meant giving up my health, my time, and even my identity, so that I could be what people needed. I just don't understand how the price of safety could ever be too high. Maybe that's what the problem is, Gran groaned, and dragged a hand down his face. You've never known the meaning of restraint, Toshinori. For you, it's always plus ultra or nothing. Maybe that's why All for One suits you so well. I don't know, but, kid, look where that mentality has gotten you. I know Nighteye has called you out on your self-destructive habits before. I sure as hell have. And probably Recovery Girl and Eraserhead too. Heck, even Nezu has given you an earful a time or two. So I know you can't deny it's a problem. Gran looked at him sharply, and Toshinori resisted the urge to squirm in his seat, like a middle schooler getting scolded. You don't ever hold back, kid. You go at your goals with everything, which is part of what makes you a great hero, but it's also what's gotten you to the point where you have to carry around that goddamn handkerchief every day. For you, no price is too high to pay. So you can't get it through your thick head that other people have limits, Toshinori. Other people look at unwinnable fights and would rather escape with their lives. Other people lose half their internal organs and retire instead of pushing themselves to ruin. Toshinori shrunk back in his seat, and Gran paused as he realized he had stood up at some point and was now yelling at the number one hero. Not that he probably cared about rank. He sighed and dropped back down in his chair. Other people would rather live life on their own terms than be protected, Toshinori. Deku's safety, the way you see it, would come at the cost of his happiness and his ability to control his life. Can you at least see why that price might be more than he's willing to pay? So let me get this straight, Aizawa said slowly. All Might knowingly gave a teenager, a student, a quirk that not only comes with a yet unknown quantity of power, but also an insane number of quirks and a possibly immortal nemesis hell-bent on destroying him. Did I leave anything out? In his defense, Miria grinned awkwardly. I really don't think he knew about the other quirks. And he fully believed All for One to be dead, Nezu added. He wouldn't have if he just thought things through for once in his life, Aizawa sighed. That man is the height of irrationality. Izuku nodded in agreement. Sensei. Kurogiri's voice appeared to his left. You have visitors.
Perfect.
All for One used one of his telekinesis quirks to turn off the television, and straightened up to look more intimidating. Not that he needed much help, what with being quite literally a faceless villain, but still.
Bring them here.
There was a slight whoosh of air as Kurogiri used Warp Gate, and then a low whistle.
Whoa! These are some nice digs you got here. All this equipment must have cost a pretty penny, but that's probably chump change for a symbol of evil, isn't it?
Gran. All for One kept a professional air, and was almost grateful All Might had blinded him, so that he didn't have to see Grian's stupid smirk. He knew he was wearing one. Men like him always did. One would think that brokers were easy to manipulate, because they would do anything for a price, but the truth was the opposite. Men like Grian were always much more comfortable doing the manipulating, which meant that, although doing business with them was necessary, All for One preferred not to draw it out.
I assume the other person with you is the man I asked you to find.
There was a small squeak from their other guest.
Yes, sir. I was told that you wanted me to, identify someone for you. It's sometimes hard because I just see a face, and sometimes it takes a little to track down who that face belongs to, but,
The man chuckled nervously.
I've, heard you don't like being disappointed, so, I'll do my best.
All for One smiled, something that he knew was both comforting and intimidating at the same time, and held out his hand. The man took it with only a slight hesitation, a sure sign that he didn't know exactly who he was dealing with. Excellent. Any other quirk, All for One would have been tempted to steal at that moment. Actually, he was tempted to steal it. He could feel the quirk humming just below the man's skin, practically begging to be put to better use than this sniveling sycophant could ever manage. But All for One simply took the man's hand firmly and let go. It would be counterintuitive for a blind man to steal a quirk that required eyesight.
I have an article I'd like you to read,
All for One said simply. He gestured to Kurogiri, who held out a tablet that would have already had one of the anonymous poster's more popular articles displayed on the screen.
I would like to know who wrote it.
The man laughed nervously as he took the tablet.
Well, like I said, I'll try, but I haven't seen every face, so...
The man gulped, as All for One let a tad of his intimidating aura seep into the air. He was done with words. It was time for action. And, on the off chance that the man was unable to identify who he needed, it would be simple to give his quirk to someone who could. The man read silently, thankfully, for a few minutes, before he chuckled again, this time sounding relieved instead of anxious.
Here I was, all worried for nothing. Turns out, your guy's actually pretty popular. His face has been in the news a lot lately. So, if I can just look up his name.
Who is he? All for One demanded impatiently.
Oh, it's that quirkless kid from the sports festival,
the man said dismissively.
The one who fought Stain? Deku, I think his name was. Ah, yes, here it is. Izuku Midoriya.
The man paused and swallowed, his nerves back in full force as All for One's rage almost tangibly enveloped the room.
Did I say something wrong?